A phenomenon that seems unique to the home computer scene of the 1980s is the sheer number of games that very clearly and unapologetically aped popular arcade hits of the day. I've spent a lot of time trawling through old home micro games for interesting ones to feature on this show, and it amuses me how often the games I find aren't so much paying homage to a classic as ripping it off wholesale. And Gnasher for the ZX Spectrum is about as direct a rip-off as you can get, so this will be a fairly direct review. As you can see, it's a blatant Pac-Man clone, which seems straightforward enough, I guess. But is it worth a retro enthusiast's time today? Something I should clarify before going further is that, despite having just used it quite freely, I'm not a huge fan of the term rip-off when describing games, even when they're obvious clones, because I know full well how dismissive that sounds, especially when we're talking about an era in gaming where they were often the product of tiny development teams, sometimes, as in this case, comprising just a single programmer. But there's no two ways about it. You can see for yourself just how closely Gnasher resembles Namco's Pac-Man. Unsurprisingly, the basic frameworks of the two are near identical. In either game, you guide an ever-hungry, sentient wheel of cheese around a maze, gobbling up pills until there are none left to gobble, all the while avoiding ghosts, which in Gnasher look a little more like weird Cthulhu jellyfish monsters, and not unattractively so, I hasten to add. Special oversized pills turn your ghostly nemesis blue so that you can eat them for extra points, which is absolutely not a terrifying concept when you start thinking about it, and occasional bonus items appear that bestow even more points when chowed down on. It sounds like these games could be carbon copies of each other, but Gnasher deviates from Namco's blueprint quite a bit when it comes down to the finer details of its execution. And not in a good way, unfortunately. The problem with Gnasher is that it's very obviously trying to be Pac-Man, but it doesn't really play or feel like Pac-Man. For one thing, it's just nowhere near as fluid as it needs to be. You have to allow for the fact that this was intended to run on Spectrum computers with just 16K of onboard RAM. But the way things move on screen certainly betrays the fact that it's been coded within strict technical constraints. All the sprites move incrementally in character blocks, which gives it that characteristically jerky 16K look. But the bigger issue is that it just doesn't handle right. In Namco's Original, when you move your pill-popping protagonist, he keeps going whichever way you steer him until you either change direction or he runs into a wall. In Gnasher, he stops moving when you take your hands off the controls, so you have to keep the keyboard or joystick controls pressed in any given direction to stay mobile, which feels like that bit more of a struggle. There's an unusual feature in that a key is assigned with a hold function. Essentially, this freezes the screen, meaning neither you nor the ghosts can move, which gives players some room to take a breather and plan ahead when things are getting hectic. This feels like a bit of a redundant feature though, and the controls are sticky and unresponsive enough that even if you do make use of it to strategize, there's no guarantee you'll actually manage to pull off what you intend to. The dimensions of the maze also don't feel correct. It's wider than it is tall and very simple in comparison to the genuine article, which I suppose is okay if you approach this as its own game. But let's be honest, it's not really different enough to warrant that mindset. And coupled with the sizable on-screen characters, it all feels a bit claustrophobic. The Ghost AI is nowhere near as complex as Namco's either, which does change the way it plays. I noticed this when I inevitably got to a point where, once there were only a few pills left in one area of the screen, the ghosts immediately started homing in on me. That made it quite hard to finish the maze, and the strategy I ended up using was to leave a power pill somewhere until the end, just so that I could grab it and then plough through the ghosts to get to the last remaining pills without fear of dying. What's telling here is that I didn't get the sense that I do from a decent home port of Pac-Man, that the ghosts had their own individual patterns of behaviour, which is probably expecting a bit much from this game, I know. But then, that's my problem with these kinds of knockoffs. Once I know how the game is supposed to be, I can't unknow it. I can put those kinds of concerns aside if a game brings something of its own to the table, to give it a sense of its own identity. But Gnasher doesn't really do that. When I chance upon games like this, I can't help but think how they speak to the Wild West nature of their era. You couldn't put something like this out there today for fear of an immediate takedown on grounds of copyright infringement. But as I said at the start, close copies of popular games were 10 a penny back then. Sometimes you'd even see multiple poor man's versions of certain titles, and sometimes one of these, shall we say, unofficial ports would be even better than the fully licensed real deal. That's not the case with Gnasher though. It's an interesting game to look at from a historical and technical perspective, and it's nicely presented, with some surprisingly faithful nods to its inspiration. But for my money, it's not a great version of the game it's painting itself to be. I quite enjoy a decent Pac-Man clone, and there's a good selection of those to choose from on the ZX Spectrum. But if you want something more accurate to the original, you're probably best off leaving this one alone and looking elsewhere.